On the fifth Sunday of Lent, the church gives us another passage from the Gospel of St. John. This is the famous story of the Raising of Lazarus. Let's begin with John chapter 11, verses 1 through 45. Here's the Gospel for the fifth Sunday of Lent. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness is not unto death, for it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by means of it. All right, pause there. Notice something real quick, that this story contains the characters of Mary and Martha, the two sisters, who also appear only in the Gospel of Luke, with the famous account of Martha busy with much serving, while Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet and listening to his teaching. So John here appears to assume that you know who those characters are, right? So keep that in mind as we move through the story, because you're going to see the characteristics of Mary, who's very contemplative, and Martha, who's very active, showing up in this Gospel as well. Now let's keep going. Verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. All right, pause. Notice this. John explicitly says that the reason Jesus stays longer once he hears that Lazarus is sick is because he loved him. Now that's a puzzle. We're gonna have to come back to that. But it's really important to note it as we're moving through the story. So it continues. Then after this he said to the disciples, Let us go into Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were but now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. Okay, pause there. So here, when the disciples say, let's go into Judea again, he's using that term Jews to refer to the Judeans, meaning the southerners, the people of Jerusalem and the south who rejected Jesus as a Galilean coming down from the north. So that's what he's getting at here, those who don't see the light of the world, who are spiritually blind. He's not talking about religious Jews, because Mary's a Jew, Martha's a Jew, Lazarus is a Jew. Okay, he's talking about the southerners versus the Galileans. Just keep that in mind as we're walking through. In other words, Judea, Jerusalem, and the city in the south is becoming dangerous. And so the disciples say, why do you want to go back there? They're going to kill you. Now, keep going. Verse 11, Jesus spoke, and he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awake him out of sleep. Now the disciples said to him, Oh, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, then he will recover, right? So they think that Lazarus is just, taking a long nap, or maybe he's in a coma or something, like he's asleep. But Jesus says, now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. And then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go that we may die with him. Pause there. Notice Thomas recognizes Judea is getting dangerous for Jesus and his disciples, and yet he's willing to go and die for Christ. So we always talk about Thomas as the doubting Thomas, but we forget he's also courageous Thomas. He's the one who's willing to go into dangerous territory with Jesus to die with him. In verse 21, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, Oh, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, he who is coming into the world. Okay, pause there. Notice what just happened. Lazarus is dead. He's been dead 4 days. When Jesus comes, Mary says, if you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened, which the reader now knows isn't true, because Jesus knew about Lazarus' sickness and that he was going to die, but he stayed longer and allowed it to happen. Why does Jesus wait 2 days longer to go to Judea? Well, this is an interesting thing. John says very specifically that Jesus did this because he loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. That's a very mysterious thing. I mean, can you imagine a situation where, so let's say I'm giving a lecture in class at the seminary, and my wife calls and says, you know, your daughter is very sick, right? Very, very sick. I think she might be dying. And I would respond, okay, well, I'm going to stay here at work a couple of days longer because I love her. I mean, that's totally counterintuitive. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But Jesus isn't an ordinary man. He doesn't have an ordinary love for Lazarus. He allows Lazarus, his friend, to suffer and die because he's going to bring him back from the grave. And in the living tradition, St. John Chrysostom, different fathers of the church would explain it this different ways, but St. John Chrysostom said this about this, quote, he said, "Many are offended when they see any of those who are pleasing to God suffering anything terrible. Those who are offended by this, however, do not know that those who are especially dear to God have it as their lot to endure such things, as we see in the case of Lazarus, who was also one of the friends of Christ, but was also sick." So what Chrysostom is pointing out here is there's a mysterious reality about the Christian life, that those who are called to a special holiness, those who in a sense God loves in a special way, he often, frequently allows to suffer in a special way. He allows to suffer in a great way. I mean, and if you want any proof of this, just look at the life, pick the life of any great saint. John Paul II, St. John Paul II, he has his Parkinson's, right? St. Bernadette of Subaru had a tumor. St. Therese of Lisieux, tuberculosis. To say nothing of all the martyrs, right? Who God allows not just to suffer, but to be put to death for the sake of their faith. So on a natural level, you would see that and you would say, God must not love these people because they're sick and they're suffering and they're dying. And what John is revealing to us here is, no. God, those whom God loves in a special way, he draws into the mystery of the cross. He draws into the mystery of his own suffering and his own death. And that's what Chrysostom's saying here about Lazarus. Now, does that mean that Jesus doesn't feel the pain of Lazarus's suffering, or that it makes his suffering somehow good? No. When Jesus encounters the suffering of Lazarus, when he encounters the fact that Lazarus has died and been buried, what does he do? In his humanity, he weeps, just like Martha. He feels the fullness of the pain of the loss of Lazarus. Christ does not diminish the reality and the horror of suffering by redeeming it. He fully participates in that, and he shows us that to weep and to mourn over the suffering and death of the world is natural, and it's a good thing. He himself does it. He recognizes that suffering and death is an evil, right? And he feels the pain of that loss in his own human heart. However, he allows it to take place because there's a greater glory to be revealed. St. Peter Chrysologus said this in his homily on the raising of Lazarus. He said, the reason Jesus allowed Lazarus to suffer and die is, quote, because for Christ it was more important to conquer death than it was to cure disease. He showed his love for his friend not by healing him, but by calling him back from the grave. Instead of a remedy for his illness, he offered him the glory of rising from the dead. And this really gets to the essence of why the church picks the story of the raising of Lazarus for the 5th Sunday in Lent. Because this is the last Sunday before Palm Sunday. And what we're preparing to celebrate during Holy Week is the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the last miracle she's going to put before us on the 5th Sunday of Lent, before we get to Holy Week, is Jesus' demonstration of his power over sin and death in the raising of Lazarus, to show that he has power over the grave, that he can raise Lazarus from the dead, even after the tomb has been closed for 4 days and Lazarus' body has begun to rot, has begun to decompose. That is no barrier to Jesus' power to give him life. That's what the raising of Lazarus is about. It points in a twofold way to Jesus' power over the grave that he's going to show us on Easter Sunday when he rises from the dead. And it also points forward to our own resurrection on the last day at the end of time when he will give life to us. And so I'll end with this beautiful quotation from Andrew of Crete. He was an Eastern Church father, and he gave a homily on the raising of Lazarus, which was basically written in a kind of song form where Jesus is speaking to Lazarus. And it's a meditation on Jesus' words, "Come out," right? Where Jesus commands him to come out of the tomb. And this is what Andrew of Crete said: "Lazarus, come out. As a friend, I'm calling you. As Lord, I'm commanding you. Come out. Let the stench of your body prove the resurrection. Let the burial linen be undone so that they can recognize the one who was put in the tomb. Come out. Come out of the tomb. Teach them how all creation will be enlivened in a moment when the trumpet's voice proclaims the resurrection of the dead."